In this session, we will focus on the term hazardous situation. This term is related to the term hazard that we discussed in the last session. But often there's a lot of confusion in applying these terms, especially if you are used to using FMEA or a failure modes and effects analysis as the only tool of risk analysis in your risk management process. So we will look at the definition of this term, illustrate with a few examples of how it is related to hazards, and also show some examples of the points of confusion when you use an FMEA, discuss the regulatory perspective briefly, and then finally emphasize a few key points again that you should keep in mind and remember. The term hazardous situation is defined in the ISO 14971 standard as circumstances in which people, property, or the environment is or exposed to one or more hazards. Most of the time we focus on people, either users or patients, but understand that within the context of ISO 14971, property or the environment are also included as part of hazardous situation analysis. Hazardous situations occur through a sequence of events, and this concept is very important to understand clearly. Typically, there is a trigger event. That trigger event leads to a sequence of events, and there could be more than one. That leads to a hazardous situation where the patient or the user is exposed to one or more hazards and a harm may occur. Now, when thinking about this sequence of events, you can start from the bottom up, or you can start from the top down, beginning from the harm. And when you do hazard analysis, which we will discuss in the next module, you can do this exercise iteratively back and forth, working with your engineering SMEs and medical experts to develop a very good description of all the hazards, how they are involved in hazardous situations, and how they are linked to harms. Now, hazards are present in a hazardous situation, and it is necessary for a user or a patient to be exposed to hazards in a hazardous situation for harm to occur. This is very important. Let's take the scenario of an electrical connector here with frayed wires. This is clearly a hazardous situation. This is where electrical hazards may be involved when someone touches that wire and is now exposed to the electric current or voltage. Similarly, if you come in contact with a potentially infected person, you are exposed to biological hazards such as bacteria or virus. Let's say you see a chemical spill on the floor. That is a hazardous situation. Now, many different events might have happened before that to happen. In this scenario, you are exposed to one or more different types of chemical hazards. So this is the relationship between hazards and hazardous situations. It's very important to clearly identify which hazardous situation we are talking about and what kind of hazards are involved in that hazardous situation. To emphasize, device failure modes are not hazardous situations, and this confusion is common in the industry as FMEAs are practiced quite commonly. Let's give an example. You have a continuous glucose monitor that fails to trigger a high value alarm due to a software error. You might find that as a line item in your FMEA. However, this may lead to a hazardous situation where the patient experiences a high blood glucose level as a hazardous situation. Failing to trigger an alarm is only an initial event. Many other events have to happen as part of the sequence of events before a hazardous situation occurs. And a challenge in a tool like FMEA, which is a single fault line item tool, it is difficult to articulate all different sequence of events that lead to a hazardous situation. So simply equating a failure mode to a hazardous situation can lead to a lot of confusion. Second example, expired reagent used in a rapid antigen test leads to a false negative result. This may lead to a hazardous situation where someone is not able to get timely medical care. False negative result, again, is only an initial event. Inadequate access control introduces a cybersecurity vulnerability in an infusion pump connected to a hospital network. Here is a latent vulnerability that can be exploited. We don't even have a trigger event to lead to a hazardous situation. So items on the left you will typically see in a failure mode effects analysis instrument, and items on the right are descriptors that you have to keep in mind as you build your sequence of events to fully understand what a specific hazardous situation might be in your scenario. And you will do that analysis as part of hazard analysis, not FMEA. Now, regulatory perspective is that risk analysis is required as part of design validation, and this risk analysis should include understanding of hazards, hazardous situation, and harms. Correctly linking hazards to hazardous situations and harms is key part of risk analysis. That's why that linkage becomes very important. And effectiveness of risk controls is evaluated in the context of their link to device malfunctions and associated hazards and hazardous situations. It's a linkage, not necessarily a direct one-to-one cause and effect. That's the key point to keep in mind. So in summary, a hazardous situation usually occurs as a result of a sequence of events following a trigger event. And it's a circumstance in which people, property, or the environment is exposed to one or more hazards. So it's exposure to hazard is what happens in a hazardous situation. It occurs as a result of a sequence of events, not a single event. It is very important not to confuse failure modes with hazardous situations, especially if you're using an FMEA. And finally, you must build the correct linkages between your failure modes and hazards and hazardous situations by using different types of tools and instruments. You should not try to do it all in one place, such as an FMEA. And we will discuss this point at other places during the course as we talk about specific risk management activities. But at this point of time, it's very important to understand that we should not confuse failure modes with hazardous situations.